Yeah, that's why my friend bought this Energizer, because of that particular theory. And it turns out that there's a lot more, especially in the healing avenue, that demonstrates that increase in charge in the real science of the world, not the fake science of general relativity and quantum mechanics. That's all pretend, which is why they keep inventing new things that they can't find. It started with the electron. Nobody can find an electron. They just say it has to be there. Show that it does things, and so it must be there, but they can't find it. And it doesn't behave the way it's supposed to. Like, they don't repel each other if you get them to sit in a container, because you can't do that. They aren't there. And now they're looking for bosons, which are the same thing. They're just making up something that justifies their logic, but it's not real. But I don't want to keep dissing it, because that's a tendency that all the guys that understand how things really work like to do. It turns out that the energy that makes that atom of oxygen shrink is the energy that also promotes life. And oxygen is one of those atoms that can take a huge amount of energy and hold it. And so you can have things like energized oxygen. You can have 3 oxygen atoms bond together, but in a shared way, because it, rather than form a linear or equilateral structure, it's always an isosceles. So one oxygen atom appears to have more energy than the other 2, which material science can't explain. That doesn't make any sense. But water, it turns out, is not always that one bent thing, which is close to a tetrahedral in terms of its shape. Maybe you remember that. 2 points. A tetrahedron has 4 corners and equilateral triangles forming all sides, right? Remember that? It's the simplest, most stable geometric 3-dimensional form. Okay? So water supposedly is like that. 2 paired electrons on one end, 2 vertices, and 2 hydrogen, tiny little atoms at the other ones, right? But they're the big ones, and the oxygen's the small one in the middle. So it turns out when you energize it, and I found this on the web and I didn't copy it, and I'm so pissed. A guy, because I can't find it anymore, it's been scrubbed. A guy you can actually image atoms and their energy patterns now and molecules, and a guy imaged a water molecule that was not tetrahedral, it was actually planar. The 2 hydrogen atoms are coming out here, and one pair was here, but the other pair formed a p orbital, which is a really high energy orbital compared to the bonding orbitals, which, I don't know, orbital theory is kind of messy, and there are lots of them because none of them work. So they changed the description depending on what you're using or trying to examine in a molecule. But essentially, the tetrahedral form is the lowest energy, and but he found a triangular one that had higher energy. And I believe that these guys that are making this gas are making a linear one that has 2 full E orbitals, and then also an energized shared sp hybrid orbital that holds the hydrogens in, but it's in a linear form. Okay? So this molecule has way more energy in it than this one. And it has so much energy that it no longer does the hydrogen bonding, okay? Which actually is just the orbital sharing energy, because they're starved. They need to have more energy, so it naturally clumps together because collectively they can be stable. So typical water forms this nice clumped, huge molecule because it's more stable, not because it's attracted to other ones. It actually needs to be in that configuration. And then a molecule that size normally would be a gas, but the clumping makes it much, much bigger, so it's a liquid. And it gives all the life-giving properties that we enjoy: surface tension, slow diffusion of stuff, huge heat sink, in terms of evaporative cooling. All that energy goes into the bonding before it gets so shaken up that it actually vaporizes.
Are they creating these molecules.
They're creating linear water.
Well, it goes through this carburation process that you're talking
Yes,
about.
yeah, that carburation process is really cool because it's actually
It's taking the regular water that you're thinking of and creating it to the TP oxygen as it's going through the plate.
that's what's happening.
And that has carrying so much energy, right?
Right.
That it's willing to give it to the engine to give
Actually, it gives it to whatever is with it in the gas, okay? And that energy comes out at such a high pulse, it breaks up the nucleus of those other materials. That's how it cleans the air. It actually deconstructs petroleum. And he has burned crude oil. He has burned diesel fuel. He's burned jet fuel. He's burned gasoline. He's burned pea, pickle juice, you name it. He's turned it completely into energy because he mixes the exhaust with the intake, and what comes out has less mass than what goes in.
It's completely absorbed.
Completely turned to energy.
Yeah, completely.
Wow.
And so he can. That's how you can shut off the exhaust. In a regular car, you can't do that because it makes more gas than you put into it, more vapor than you put into
So
it.
if there's anything coming out of the exhaust, you just recycle it back.
Exactly. And eventually it all gets turned into
Nothing.
but energy, movement down the road. Okay. Tom.
An experimental fact to me is that if I put a piece of moldified tektite in a glass jug of water and pour energy into it, with or without through a crystal, until it seems to light up and be full and the energy flow stops, that water not only has a higher viscosity than it had before, it has mild psychedelic effects. It puts you in a space where your bonds of reality are a little shifty. And I always thought of that as something about pouring the energy in until it's full, but in the presence of the moldavite, it just energizes it with the flavor and color of the moldavite. But the water, even, you could say that the mild psychedelic effects are my imagination, but the viscosity change is not. What do you think will happen?
It's measurable. You can measure the surface tension, the curve on a glass, so obviously it's not.
You can feel it in your mouth.
And yes, the slipperiness and
Yeah.
everything changes. That's absolutely correct. It is verifiable physically.
What do you think is happening to the water?
Well, I think that it's getting energized, but it's interesting that you talk about how the moldavite shapes it,
Yeah.
because some guys make this water in pressurized containers, and they have noticed that they replicate the materials that are in the container. So one guy in particular, uses silver liquid solutions in his thing, and he's realized that he's precipitating silver out of the bottom of his tank while he's making the gas. So the current theory is, and it hasn't been tested, but other people actually validated his claim that he did that. There was another gentleman in the audience who I want to say purifies, but he purifies the highly toxic water that comes out of wells, oil wells, that can't even be flushed. I mean, there are some controls over that. So his business, and he does it through electrolysis, and he noticed the same thing. He said, I actually am making silver. He said, I put a little in the solutions as they go through, and it drops out the bottom.
Can you precipitate gold bars? Is that one?
You can. The guy who did it said, he actually is an alchemist, and he said everybody who's ever made gold for profit has suffered for it, so he refuses to make gold in bar form. He'll make the liquids, since they are solutions that he's using, and he'll sell the solutions, which some solutions actually sell for a higher price than the bars.
Are they like colloidal?
Yeah, colloidal.
What's colloidal?
It's just it's a way of dissolving the metals into solutions. So it usually involves vegetables or something else that traps it in it, but that's colloidal silver or colloidal. Any supplement you take is actually encased in a vegetable molecule, so your body will digest it and absorb it more effectively.
So kind of switching a little bit, you made a comment that this oxygen, the bigger ones, actually they have the energy that supports life or something like that.
Oh, yeah, well, it turns out, so let's get into the electrical side of things, right? My discipline was an electrical engineer. When I started my education, the first thing they said is, you've all heard of ethers, right? Ether, a little ancient Greek idea of what was the basis of reality. Well, I was told in no uncertain terms, they were very ignorant back then. They didn't have material science that we did, and they made that up, and it's not real. So forget it. And I did. I wanted to make an A in the class, right? So I forgot it.
Follow the program.
And follow the program, and everything is based on matter. This hard material reality, and only things you can measure with hard science and machines that can be duplicated by people that are independently viewing things, not trying to direct or expect an outcome, are valid. And so we took off, and then there's this device called a capacitor, right? You've all heard of capacitors. You actually use them every day if you touch anything with technology or plug anything into the wall.
Back to the future.
Because, flux capacitor, so remember that. Okay, so capacitors separate voltage, right? And they're described as all the electrons pile up on one side, creating a negative charge, and so there ends up being a positive charge over here, which they don't really explain. In semiconductors, they do. They say, well, there are holes where the electrons can fit in the material matrices, right? So they invent a hole now.
So like a lack of electrons or something.
Yes, but they call it a hole, and actually some of the circuits, the only way they can explain them is by holes migrating, because there are no electrons involved. So they talk about hole movement even, which is equally insane. But, as a student, you go, okay, sure, no problem.
Just give me the grade.
Just give me that A so I can get a job, So the trick is that current flows between these plates in a capacitor, and there's no connection. There's in fact an insulator that blocks current flow in that definition, in that reality. So an impossible acting device is active in every circuit that you ever touched, right? Or any use of power you ever used, and they can't explain. Okay? Now, ether scientists can. Because for an ether scientist, the basis of reality is a field, not a particle.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
And I looked up field in Wikipedia. It's always fun reading about Wikipedia because they give you a lot of information that if you think about it, you go, man, that's fucked up. I mean, seriously. So material scientists believe that fields are real because they act on things at a distance, but the only way they can do that is with a material part of them doing the work. So there must be a boson. Maybe you've heard of Higgs bosons, but as being the mystical particle they're still trying to find with that multi-billion-dollar, multi-nation collider, right?
Is that some interdimensional particle or something?
There you go. Yeah, interimaginational.
Interimaginational?
Yeah. So a boson is this mystical particle of a field that actually does the work, okay, in material science. For ether scientists, there's just a field and the fields interact, and that's actually what makes up matter. Okay, so there's no issue there, and you can directly engage it. And so it turns out that if you take a capacitor and use oil as the insulator in a cube, you can take a charged capacitor, take the oil out of that, put it between two other plates, and the charge goes with it.
With the oil.
With the oil. It's not in the plates, because there are no such things as electrons. Okay? There's just a field that's directional, and dielectric fields, they call it, a dielectric energy, is actually connected to the ether. And it's that imbalance in the ether that is what a dielectric charge is. So if you take that as a possible reality, then you can start doing all kinds of things that you can't do as a material scientist, including making flux capacitors. Okay? So flux is the way you measure magnetic fields. When dielectric and magnetic fields get together, you get electricity that everybody's using, right? That's what that is, the combination of the two. If you realize that it's the combination of the two, then you can start separating them out. Now, power is generated by separating them out, okay? It's used all the time, but nobody looks at it that way. And they also require that those two components come back together before you can use it. Okay? Now the interesting thing is each of those components, if you separate them out, will spawn the other one, because they are both fields that support each other. So, but you can't separate them under certain conditions, like in a permanent magnet. They are extremely separated. The magnetic field is way beyond the physical confines of the permanent magnet. The dielectric field, which is attached to it, is really compressed, and that's why the magnetic field is so big. But the dielectric field is the one that's actually doing, the heart of the energy there. And here I almost so want to get to an illustration, but I'm trying not to, because I want you guys to really think about this rather than just see it and go, oh, okay, it's that. So think about this. Dielectric fields can be concentrated. When they're concentrated, what they do is they tend to contract. That's their nature, contract. As you concentrate them and they contract, they force an expression of the magnetic field. So that goes out away from it. Okay? So orthogonally. So if you compress in a plane the dielectric field, it will force vertical extension of the magnetic field. This magnetic field and the dielectric fields that are compressed like that have a rotation to them, just like a gyroscope. In fact, it really patterns the gyroscope. It's scary, but the physical effects of matter actually pattern the atomic effects. There's really no difference. So you've seen pictures of galaxies that have this large disk, right? And then they have these odd shapes, luminous shapes, and they have these spikes of energy going out of them. Okay? That is exactly what's happening in the magnet. That disk represents the dielectric field. The spike coming out of it and the field around it is the magnetic field. And that happens with every magnet. Now, magnets don't have north and south poles. Okay? If you flip a magnet over, it'll do exactly what the other magnet's doing if they were in line before, because it's the same thing. It's just that that disk pushes out the center magnetic field from the center, but it's spinning the same direction in both sides. So if you flip one over, it's turning in the opposite direction that the other one is now. And so there is no north and south pole. And, physics instructors love to say to their students, if you ever come up with a monopole magnet, you'll get a Nobel Prize, because they always come in pairs. Well, that's because they ignore the dielectric effect and they consider these two things as independent opposite things when they're actually just one thing. So every magnet actually is a monopole magnet. It's just, you can flip it because it has a dielectric field that's in the center of it. Now, and also what they can't explain, which is kind of fun, and I want to talk about magnets just for a little bit, because magnets are each atom of the magnetized material doing this thing. Since they're fields, if they're aligned, they combine. So this massive magnet that has this uniform, huge field around it is actually just a combination of all these little fields together. So if you put two magnets together, that dielectric disk, which is in the magnetic center of your magnet, will instantly shift to the center of the two joined magnets. And that dielectric disk has some special properties. If you have a thin magnet, it will not be able to sit counter to that disk, because the two fields will force themselves to align. So on that center line, a thin magnet will actually sit and be there. Now, one of the experiments, the guy who wrote about this, his name is Ken Wheeler. Okay? Yeah, that's amazing. The guy's a tattooed, he's a young tattooed freak, and he's now putting videos out with this stuff, showing this stuff on video. But
I'm thinking of Ken Wilber, Spectrum.
Okay, Wheeler, W-H-E-E-L-E-R, and he's been in love with magnets forever, and he actually started researching and trying to make sense of them because material science cannot explain a magnet. So he said that he's put a huge neodymium magnet on his refrigerator, put a thin disc magnet in this dielectric plane, right, and then turned it. And the whole fridge jumped. That's how powerful this force is. It will force the whole fridge, because this thing's so stuck to the fridge, the whole thing now becomes magnetized. The whole thing moves. And I'm thinking,
it was the magnet.
we're talking, I mean, it had to be $1,000 worth of neodymium, because he said, you know, a big, he just said a big one. I haven't seen the video, I'm sure it's on it, but I haven't seen the video, I just read the description. And he said he can actually make his fridge jump. It'll start bouncing up and down when he turns it. Now,
Sounds like a YouTube video of me.
yeah,
That sounds like better than using a lever. You just go like this and your fridge jumps.
well,
We can use that in
have
moving
you
truck.
guys heard of Coral Castle?
Yes,
No.
we've been there.
You've been there, okay?
Yeah,
Coral
Homestead,
Castle
Florida.
is a place where this guy used huge chunks of coral to build structures and art and doors
Oh, yeah.
by himself without any manual labor
Yeah.
at night.
Where is
Okay.
it again, Mark?
Homestead, Florida,
Homestead, Florida.
right below.
And that's not its original location. It was moved there,
Where is it?
yeah, from where he first built it.
Oh, yeah, that's
Um,
cool.
so
Yes.
you can read about this on the internet. It's quite popular. It's a tourist attraction.
What is it called?
Coral,
Coral?
like sea coral, you know, and castle.
Scuba diving.
And,
Is it underwater?
No. The guy farmed coral and huge chunks of it, and then built this huge, out of these huge chunks that weigh tons, right? By himself at night, right? You would have the trucks come up with these huge loads, leave the truck beds with the rocks on them. The next day, they'd all be gone and in place. Okay? So,
He had help.
no.
No.
He had
No, I mean,
he had a jerry rig that had this interesting electromagnet that was more or less hand cranked. And that's all we know about his technology.
Isn't
I'm
it
thinking-
illegal to take coral?
I'm thinking what he did is he wrapped a magnetizable band around the big chunks of coral. Well, this is not in a place where it's protected, obviously. I mean, Florida has a lot of coral off
This
the
was some
coast.
years ago.
And it was some years ago. And used the ability to get it, I mean, he could literally just jump it in place, or, you know, it actually caused it to change its gravitational mass.
There's some human story to this too. He did this for a woman.
So he's motivated by a woman. Who isn't? Who isn't? What guy isn't motivated by a woman? So,
It never came back to him.
so what's interesting about this dielectric plane is that a small, thin disc of magnetizable metal will not sit on that dielectric plane because it's not magnetic there. Okay? It won't stay there. It'll fall off if you do it. It'll just fall. If you leave it there like this, it'll rotate instantly in a line with the magnetic fields and then sync up its own dielectric plane with that because it's induced. Okay? So those behaviors, none of those can be explained by material science. Okay, they can only be explained by field science or ether science. Okay? So what's cool about that whole process, okay, about magnetism in matter behaving differently, because some materials express this field in a large way, is that if you bring a magnetic field into connection with a magnetizable thing, it takes on that feature. Essentially, it multiplies the magnetic component of that device, right? So by coiling wires around a magnet, you can, when that magnetic field changes, that will force a voltage into the wires, okay? And that gives you power, all right? Now, because the power comes in pairs, a magnet isn't just that dielectric moving in one direction and the magnetic field going in the other direction. That magnetic field also generates a reverse dielectric field. And that generates a reverse magnetic field. So that globular shape isn't a result of one field, that's the result of two fields coming together. Okay? And one of the interesting illustrations Wheeler does is he takes this big neodymium square cube magnet and he takes a glump of this colloidal clay that has magnetizable materials in it, puts them together and watches the two join. And what happens is that big magnet gets sucked into this clay that's magnetizable and it forms a ball. It's not a sphere because it integrates all those fields and everything becomes magnetized.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. It looks like, you know, you remember that original movie, The Thing, or, you know, the
Yeah.
blob that absorb stuff. It looks like the thing eating a magnet. It's really cool. Just a few pictures, you see
So
the thing.
his name is Wheeler?
Wheeler, Ken.
Ken Wheeler.
His document, by the way, is impossible to read because he rails over and over again at what an ass Einstein was. Because Einstein used to believe in ether
What
physics.
about Tesla? What is that?
Tesla's an ether scientist. And his response to relativity and quantum mechanics was that the future will vindicate what I've done and what I believe,
Yeah.
and show that you guys are all just full of it.
Yeah.
So,
What how sad.
see, it's so hard to get away from that fight, though. You know, I really don't want to talk about it. Yes, go ahead.
Was he the same guy, there was some guy in Florida that knew how the pyramids were built?
Well, this is it. This is what they say, is that most likely the technology that built these pyramids and the Sphinx out of these 40,000-ton blocks that nobody can do today with
Yeah.
all the technology they have
Uh-huh.
was some sort of weird levitational thing. Well, it could very well have been magnetized levitation. Could very well. You just wrap the stones in a magnetic material or use magnetic stones, and you can lift that stuff.
But you know what is interesting though too is because when I traveled in Peru, they had these huge structures, you know, they didn't go up like the pyramid and stuff. And there was a guy named Russell years ago that talked about
Peter
tapping.
Russell.
Yeah, talked about tapping into the power there. And this makes so much sense because, you know, we say it's ETs and all this stuff come down, but if they're tapping into that universal power up there, then Peru can tap into it, Egypt could tap into it, and then,
See,
you know.
but it's not up there. It's in every single house.
Well, you know, I'm not saying that the energy's up there.
Right.
I'm saying like Einstein and the people that you said tapped into that
Okay,
galaxy of
getting the knowledge
information.
through that, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but here's the secret, or the bad news in that method, okay? Your bodies can't run themselves. They don't have the capability, and if you look at every single cell, you'll find that the communications that controls and networks them isn't in them. We are literally, our bodies are just smart drones, okay? They form habits and they do stuff, right?
Right.
But they're run by our higher consciousness, if you will, okay? That's in this other space. So as a result, your body is designed, engineered, and cannot stop but take direct commands from that, okay? It can influence it, but it has to take the direct commands. So when you start using that for knowledge, you get the impression that it is the absolute truth because your channel won't allow you to filter it. But if you have some negative stuff going on in your space, you know, through habit, exposure, pain, suffering, whatever, that will color everything you get. So if somebody in your religious group gets hurt by another religious group, tribe, whatever, and you're in that space as the spiritual leader of that group, and you happen to think negatively because your best friend just lost his daughter, you know, then guess what? You're going to feel like they are demons and need to be cleansed.
So it's almost like you tapped into God.
Right.
And then
you took what God took what God gave you and you painted it black.
Right.
Absolutely.
You made it 10 times as
Absolutely.
bad as if.
And so the challenge of these scientists who get this information is to clean up the junk. And a few have, and only through focus, have been able to do that. Okay. Now Stan Myers was one of those guys, right? Paul Pantone was one of those guys. Paul, unfortunately, because he had no technical training at all, right, couldn't cross over into explaining it in a material way, even though it wouldn't be accurate, you know, but getting it to line up. So he had no grounding whatsoever. He has, however, had multiple scientists buy his designs from him. He sells them now on a licensing basis since he can't patent it. And they all validate his work. He's had scientists come in and say, your simple little structure, which is an iron rod and 2 iron tubes, right? That's it. Fuel goes in the inside one with the rod and the exhaust flies on the outside, and that creates a static charged, dielectrically charged, magnetically sealed plasma reactor. Okay? And the water provides the plasma. And